Hello everyone, today we talk about the Kaiserschlacht and more specifically of its first phase, the culmination of the offensive. Then we will make another video talking about how things unfolded in the later part of, in fact, the so-called German Spring Offensive, where in 1918 the deadlock of trench warfare along the Western Front was embarking on its fourth year. The Germans had managed to knock out the Tsarist Empire out of the game, providing them with a very large force, expandable now on the Western Front. On the Italian front, this had already brought fruitful results with the German and Austro-Hungarian offensive of Caporetto, where the Italian lines were broken and the Italian army had to settle on the defensive Piave line that was ferociously maintained. The causes of the success are mostly the German division's Stoßtruppen tactics that actually had been pioneered by lots of these players in even earlier phases of the war. The Italians, paradoxically, were some of the earliest who had successfully employed them. However, Germany was sort of a bigger system, also provided with more resources from one side, but also more constraint and pressure from another, while the British, as we will see now, had essentially literally brought the Royal Navy on land by using tanks for the first time in history. The Germans did not really have that material availability in their country like the British Empire could, regardless of the U-boat campaign, the attack convoys that had also in part triggered like the intervention of the United States in 1917 next to the Allies in the war. And so they had to basically invest into a tactical solution to the story. You can think of German warfare in general during not just World War I, but also the second as tactical brilliance and strategic foolishness, even though this is perhaps a very debatable, let's say, statement. Like you can't maybe get the good enough definition. Things are objectively more complicated. Consider, this is what I always say when I talk about World War I, nobody had ever fought such a war before. Every war is unique, but really by scale, as we know, this one had really surpassed all others to the point that all these apparent shortcomings, sort of mistakes, excesses, etc., appear to us like just the fruit of a specifically identifiable guilt that you can, at more than a century of distance, like point the finger to and say, no, this is how they should have done or whatever. This doesn't make much sense, right? Today we know much more, including through the same war and through its military history, that at the time was and could not be immediately or readily available. We'll see it even for the Kaiserschlacht. As you know, I'm making these introductions about World War I campaigns and battles. I extending more to contemporary warfare. I have an old thing since I was little for World War I, telling the truth. So that's been more frequent as a consequence on Schwerpunkt, but we will widen the horizon hopefully soon. These videos are meant just to introduce, right, the broader strategical issue. Then, of course, in the future, we'll look at sort of more in-depth, like there are, for example, the various sectors or the various offensives within the broader one that are very interesting. There are very famous sub-battles, etc., that really became famous in the annals of military history. In this, here I will deal with the Kaiserschlacht in 2 videos. Probably I will not upload the second up to maybe a couple of months again. So we have other things going on, the Crimean War, etc. But it's important, in my opinion, like to talk about this, not just because we haven't talked about strategy too much on Schwerpunkt for different reasons, in part also because of the scale of warfare. By concentrating on medieval one, for example, it's obvious that we could have really done more about strategy. But that's something, for example, in military historiography doesn't do much for the Middle Ages proper. If you talk about contemporary warfare, it's just a more obvious, consequential thing. But it's beautiful to really look at this mosaic of battles that dynamically molded the war. We tend to have this very football match kind of, what was the result, who won, who lost, essentially abstracting this, detaching it from the context. Instead, war is an incredibly dynamic business, and as such, it's important to understand that these were not just people fighting, but after, like I was saying in this case, 4 years of confrontation that had practically yielded almost no result. Especially the Germans were aware ever since 1914 that the best they could squeeze out of all this was not just the terrible war of attrition, the, in fact, very heavy cost of which they were feeling by this point, and it was evident the war would have sort of come to an end in this major confrontations, because they were essentially the last affordable, right? And the point here was essentially breaking or losing everything, right? Had the Germans broken through the Allies' lines, they hoped to essentially secure an advantageous peace, right? Because they would have sort of been defeated already in the broader global scenario. Like Germany would have not had the strength, the immediate strength, at least to capitalize upon a breakthrough, right? That would have been a sort of readjustment of the war, probably maybe allowing for further re-expansion, etc. But as you know, also the aftermath of World War I was a tremendous exhaustion, right? If it hadn't been for the Poles, right, stopping the Bolsheviks, for example, very, very sad things would have happened. We also talked about the Freikorps, so that we offered in that video an insight into the German psychology of the later war and the immediate aftermath of the same. That's also a very fascinating chapter. If anything, sometimes for all the cliches that have been made up about the Treaty of Versailles and this weird determinism, and also sort of short-sightedness, I would say, about both the causes and the consequences of the war. But here, 1918, the Germans were still rolling, right? So they had this opportunity. Consider also the other side. We'll not focus just on the Germans in this video. The narrative is going to take quite into consideration the laws of reciprocity, especially considering, in fact, the Iron Arm attritional fight this all was. In fact, from 1915 onward, the sequence of Allied assaults had yielded progress measurable, as you know, only in yards, exacting a toll of millions of lives lost, right? I explained in a specific video the causes of so-called trench warfare. We contextualized this on the Western Front. It wasn't much a matter of technology. It was basically the balance of these major industrial powers and basically the most important balance in the entire global scenario, right? So we will, of course, talk about other theaters at some point, but there is a reason if these sides were so hard and essentially not managing to break through, even by delivering sometimes a veritable hell of fire. We've seen it in the video about the Battle of Verdun, for that matter. I'm glad to have covered that as well, because it, as you know, that was a bit like the cornerstone from which the rest of the war's German strategy followed. Now, the sole noteworthy alteration to the front line took place when, in fact, the German forces chose to pull back from a salient south of Arras were in northeastern France, basically Flanders, so leaving the nearby countryside in ruins as they withdrew to the recently built Siegfried or Hindenburg line. And the German retreat to the Hindenburg line in early 1917, the Operation Albrecht, was a strategic withdrawal, not a direct result of an Allied offensive. This is important to stress. This, by the way, showed paradoxically how the Germans at large had the upper hand, had sort of the greater moral strength in all this. After all, at this point, like the youthful, unified Germany had really surpassed France as the tendentially hegemonic continental power. And in fact, the Allied point was this border fort to prevent Germany to expand. At this point, Austria-Hungary had basically been controlled by the Germans as far as the conduct of the war was concerned. We'll talk more about Austria-Hungary and Italy because those are very interesting. I made a video about Die Strafexpedition, the Battle of the Altipiani, that was the largest mountain battle in history. As a matter of fact, and even there was sort of the Austro-Hungarian Verdun, right? Because it was happening basically also in the same period, and those offensives from in relatively to the respective theaters were actually the stronger ones. Like as we've seen in terms of tactical effectiveness, the Germans were better than especially the French, the British, the Austro-Hungarians, or the Italians. But at large, those offensives had also paradoxically dramatically boosted the defenders' morale when it was understood that these guys were not to pass, and that, after all, the defensive had worked pretty well, regardless of the losses that were even in the defense superior to the one of the attackers. But still, here, of course, there is all the backdrop of the American reinforcements arriving with sort of increasing, say, flux, let's put it in this way, but with great pressures from the British and the French, but with lots of things going on in the U.S. politics, and just, putting together an army that for the Americans, also by this scale, was something they couldn't simply do from a day to another. So that's why I make a video, let's say, not just a battle at a time, but a video for each phase of these things. It's enormous, right? We really have to begin talking about each of these topics seriously and separately. Now, across the barbed wire, the cataclysmic German campaign aimed at Verdun in 1916, as we've seen, had not succeeded in securing any enduring territorial gains. Right, the Germans now could simply decide, okay, we are actually the ones who push the most. We are the between the two in relative terms, the hammer, and they had withdrawn to the Hindenburg line. Because they had, of course, observed for example, the counteroffensive capacities of the Allies. In certain instances, this had been a problem for the Allies as well for the Germans. So again, it's a bit this back and forth. At most, like, there are tens of kilometers that the front can shift in these ways, but not more than that. From the Alps to the North Sea, that's basically it. Now, the British debut of tanks that we hinted at before, most prominently at Cambrai, in November 1917, hinted at least a potential resolution to the stalemate, or as a tip of the balance. The Cambrai is an interesting battle. We'll talk about that. Essentially, over 470 tanks supported by infantry and artillery broke through German lines, on that occasion advancing up to 5 miles. A significant gain compared to earlier trench warfare stalemates, but it's literally just 5 miles. The initial assault surprised the Germans, capturing thousands of prisoners and guns. However, mechanical failures, lack of reserves, and a swift German counterattack using stormtrooper tactics erased most gains by early December. So Cambrai showcased the potential of tanks, but also highlighted logistical and tactical limitations. And we know very well that regardless of the increasing amount of armored units in the war, especially from the side of the British, that again had sort of the greater material affluence, was a country of old industrialization and everything. The trench dilemma was not really solved until the war ended, right? It showed that technology was not the answer. It helped, but fundamentally the dynamics that it brought to trench warfare were not surpassed until the end of the war, right? Until after the end of the war, because every war at some point can entail, if it gets to that point, the collapse of one of the sides. And so this can happen even if it's trench warfare. This is technically what happened also during World War I. And it is to be seen essentially with this increasing German withdrawal on Western Front, the Italians break through, and paradoxically it would have been the Italians that would have had to invade Germany through Bavaria, Saxony, because the Germans instead were much more strongly defending from the West. So that's also an interesting thing. War could have actually dragged into 1919. There are some what-ifs, but as you know, I don't think that those are really interesting. I like history more the way it happened, right? If you look at tank warfare, by the way, we'll surely make videos about this. The World War I tank was sluggish and prone to mechanical failure, making it incapable of delivering the eagerly awaited decisive breach. And in any case, it would have not depended on that, right? It was still about fundamentally supporting infantry and getting artillery barrages that were capable of molding, or softening up the enemy defenses in any meaningful way for even a breakthrough to be attainable for, as we've seen, a few miles. Even more significantly, the highest-ranking Allied leaders possessed merely a rudimentary understanding of how to make effective use of mechanized units. As you know, behind the British tanks there was the clever Churchill, right? But before an effective tank doctrine could be developed, like you have really to await the following decades, and so in the in between wars period. Even before the war, there was a lot of the Second War. There was such a great debate regarding like how tanks should be used. You know, that every country sort of developed a certain, not just adapted, of course, to its own means and aims, but you know, nobody had really until World War II really understood like the potential effects of tank warfare in a broader European conflagration. And in fact, the results would be very, very surprising later. But that's also something else we will leave for a video on the Bewegungskrieg, commonly known as Blitzkrieg. So the protagonists here, you have Erich Ludendorff, the Kaiser's first quartermaster general, devising a strategy to essentially give this last great blow, like this great push against the Allied defenses with the objective of having it collapse. This was the moment in which Germany evidently still had the capacity to offend, and you know that essentially the two sides in a war are either like there is a war of a low reciprocity. In fact, in this, like when one offends, the other is defending, obviously enough, but as a consequence of a previous balance that had brought, for example, the offender just to have more respite, more resources to spend in the moment. So there is a tempo that requires one side at some point exhausting the offensive and the other basically launching a counter-offensive, depending also what kind of, say, this strain of blows that the adversaries have given to one another. As we were saying before, the chances of Germany to make it were there, right? Theoretically, given, as we will see now, also the sheer amount of forces involved, this was a big deal, and it was surely a problem for the Allies as much as an opportunity for the Germans. Any other consideration like, okay, but it eventually failed, is surely valid, and of course there is here more like a general moral and political issue about how the Germans had led this war, what they had made their people believe up to that point, because they knew, again, since 1914, that this negotiated peace was the best they could have achieved after a successful breakthrough of the enemy lines. Otherwise, it was over, and pretty badly how it really went down for Germany. Now, as Germany's effective military ruler and a brilliant strategist, Ludendorff had amassed a remarkable string of triumphs, especially on the Eastern Front. That is, for example, the Battle of Tannenberg as early as August 1914, a crushing defeat of two Russian armies, halting their invasion of East Prussia and cementing Ludendorff's reputation. By the way, I made a video enucleating like all the German plans for not just the Western but also the Eastern Front, from the unification of Germany to, in fact, the beginning of World War I. So if you're interested, you can check that out. The so-called Schlieffen Plan and so on. In fact, this is for saying that the 1914 German successes against the Russians were even beyond the objective estimations of the Tsarist forces, as, not much of a problem, in spite of the fact that the Marne failed, right? And so only at that point, like, the Germans should have more seriously aggressed the Russians, that, by the way, without France in the equation, could have not really done much to begin with. The Battle of the Masurian Lakes, September, this was the continuation in 1914, another victory that pushed Russian forces back, securing Germany's eastern border. There was the Gorlitza-Tarnów offensive, May 1915, a breakthrough that drove Russia out of Poland, regaining vast territories. Then the Brusilov offensive counter, right, 1916, 1917, after initial Russian gains that also bled the Austro-Hungarians white, Ludendorff stabilized the front, paving the way for Russia's collapse. Post-revolution in 1917, this had been the biggest game changer. I talked about this also in the video about the Strafexpedition, because of how basically, the Austro-Hungarians had come to depend on the Germans for most things. These successes knocked Russia out of the war with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk of March 1918. So we're basically in the spring. Offensive threshold, freeing German troops for the Western Front. Ludendorff's choice to strike in the West in 1918 was rooted in his belief that Germany had at last uncovered the tactical solution to the riddle of trench warfare, right? We've seen this also in perspective with Falcon 9's failure, or actually, theoretical success, but practical failure this is tricky, right? Because we've seen what had happened at Verdun, that the enemy had been bled white. That was the actual point. Artillery was seen as a bit like the game changer per se. And paradoxically, the infantry had been subordinated to that technological mean. And German firepower on that occasion had been so intense and devastating, it almost seemed like that was the point, which is something oddly reminiscent of Bolshevik ideology, so the subordination of humans to the same means of production in a way. By this point in the war, of course, much had changed. There had been a shift from, of course, that failure, also from a theoretical point of view, which may have instead profitably adapted at least, and so more coherent and sort of applicable fashion. But now the Germans were really running out also of materiel, and the best tactical solution was essentially deploying specially trained Stoßtruppen So the stormtroops who utilized this groundbreaking infiltration methods. I made videos also about this. How do you actually storm an enemy trench, or simply also pass through a system of trenches, which is kind of sort of a more accurate term. As we were saying before, basically by this point every country in the war had stormtroops, right? The Germans had, however, the better ones, at least the ones that were available in greater quantity and with sort of greater collective training, thus capacity to strategically behave in the sense that command had planned. The idea was really like starting from de facto small unit tactics, creating a level of attrition in the enemy defenses that would have had them collapse. Essentially, the Stoßtruppen were specialized breakthrough units that had to pass properly across, like to break through with the cover of the night, of other advantages, etc., through certain points, and basically attacking, going in depth further into the enemy defenses, and essentially attacking the enemy from the rear, while the bulk of the infantry was already engaging him, which, again, wouldn't actually solve the war either, right? Nobody really understood how to solve this, which is probably not even the best way to conceive this, because consider that we often talk this for World War I, because it seems to us that, again, trench warfare is ridiculous. There should have been maneuver, and like basically they had hoped themselves before the war broke out. But every war is specific in many ways, and it's not, again, one method or another that simply manages to surpass this apparent stall. Like in this meat grinder, in this barely moving lines of contact, actually the war is working, right? And it's, as we've seen, not just trench warfare is an extremely sophisticated and advanced way of war, but it represented a much broader struggle that got down really to the ways these people saw themselves. So there's a positivistic bias at the time, because they were still counting, as we've seen, with the same idea that artillery could surpass the infantrymen. And here there is a reversal of that once again, because it was more in line with the beginning of the war, in a way where it was more like the individual fighter, the stormtrooper. It's what the Freikorps, for example, developed themselves in their ideology. It was something really inherent, the broader Clausewitzian Prussian tactical autonomy philosophy that had really brought Germany to her first victory over France, and the same national unification, etc. So it's interesting, of course, how you can toy with this idea that big changes start from sort of small things, which is physically correct, but at the same time, we know that in war, the biggest, messiest things are actually resolved by these decisive pushes and these great hits. And so it's also evident how also during the Kaiserschlacht this system did not really work per se, also because the people from the other side, that's the point, they're not simply going to sit there and get themselves killed without a fight. So that's something that must always be appreciated. And of course, from there, you can sort of measure the temper of various countries. It was originally Furor Gallicus against Furor Teutonicus, etc. But also the bigger international picture came to mold the world also after World War I. Now, precisely 1 year prior to the war's conclusion, on November the 11th, 1917, the German High Command gathered in Mons, Belgium. This was the seat of the High Command, also various allies, heads of state and generals tended to be hosted there occasionally, to deliberate over strategies for the forthcoming spring campaigns, because it was understood that 1918 was to be really that year of the final decision of the matter. In accordance with German military custom, the meeting included the chiefs of staff from the relevant army groups rather than the field commanders themselves. Among those in attendance were Lieutenant Colonel Wetzel, Ludendorff's operations chief, and Ludendorff himself. A small word about Wetzel, that as we will see will be the voice, the counter voice to Ludendorff's plan. He was, say, by March 1918, the chief of the operations section, instrumental in planning the Kaiserschlacht. His curriculum included extensive staff work focusing on artillery and operational planning. Wetzel had served on both fronts, contributing to defensive strategies like the Hindenburg Line and offensive tactics refined on the Eastern Front, such as the same infiltration tactics. For the Kaiserschlacht, he authored a critical memorandum advocating a decisive blow against the British before American troops could tip the balance, shaping the offensive's focus on speed and surprise. However, as we will see now, his general voice would be more important in that de facto antagonistic stance to Ludendorff. In fact, the discussions revolved around potential offensives targeting the Allied defenses from Ypres down to Verdun. Ludendorff advocated for an initial strike against the British, contending that crushing their army would force France to yield, while a French defeat would still leave Britain in the fight. This was the old notion that essentially, like, yes, France could be knocked out of the war because they were considered inferior by the Germans, and just they were also a continental power, so once you march on Paris, there isn't much that France can hold at large, while the British, of course, not just have the Channel, but an empire behind the front lines, and they were tendentially a better force. At least Britain had played since the beginning of the war on quality, so they had less forces in Europe just by historical tradition, so to say. But they were quite important. They were in charge also in maintaining, of course, like the as we will see now, it did influence the same strategy of the Kaiserschlacht, the ports, the control of the main French ports that would receive, in fact, all the British, the American manpower and materiel. Ludendorff suggested focusing the attack on the southern stretch of the British front, spanning from Arras to La Fère. This sector was held by two British armies, the 3rd and the 5th, with French forces positioned south of the 5th Army. Right, so Ludendorff basically posited that targeting this Allied hinge, right, the literal jointure between the British and the French, would allow him to split these armies apart. Once the Allied line was torn open, he planned to unleash a wave of follow-up offensives north of Arras by essentially injecting reserves. Like, there had to be this massive breakthrough. We will see now how. But with the ultimate objective of pushing the British back toward the Channel coast and wiping them out in turn. A vital consideration was the weather, as the southern ground in Flanders remained unfit for military action until it dried until late spring. And so the same Germans had their armored forces, so everything was tendentially, this was also the perceivable direction. Things were actually speeding up, right? A more movemented warfare was possible, was feasible. This would be particularly evident by the very end of the war, where cavalry, for example, came back to be quite important. Just it had been especially at the very beginning of the war in 1914. So Ludendorff's staff harbored, however, doubts about this plan since the beginning. The aforementioned Lieutenant Colonel Wetzel presented a document outlining the hazards he foresaw in the proposal. He cautioned that striking the Allied hinge might not actually divide the French and British, but instead unite them, potentially prompting a French counterstrike against a vulnerable German southern flank. So this is always like the answer to a plan like this, right? As an objection, if you create a salient, right, the most vulnerable parts of it are going to be, you're going in depth, you're advancing, but what about the flanks of this salient? How many forces are you injecting in it, and won't you risk to be cut off if you go too far? Because, by the way, along the salient, say combat is going on pretty intensively. It's a quickly established front line for which you don't even have the time to properly dig in. And so World War I had definitely showed how sort of daring any kind of offensive had been, how costly, especially considering the poor results. Here, as you understand, Ludendorff, it was also, characterly speaking, a very sort of energetic, right, as typically aggressive, intense, like German character in this Prussian philosophy, really advocating for the big smash, like this enormous, as we will see now, because the forces are really scary, right? This enormous punch that should have essentially broken through, and then that was the actual point. What was this plan actually envisaging in terms of end game, right? How do you actually achieve what we were talking about before, like knocking out both the French and the British? Where do these troops have to go? Because if you have seen like the same so-called Schlieffen plan, its reedition, even in a more considerate way for how it would have been enacted in 1914, that was in part also the problem of the Germans. In that case, it was a different thing because you had essentially a major flank attack with, say, a frontal advance that was actually the diversionary thing, and this gigantic, door swinging from the right. This was not like that. This was classical breakthrough, aiming to properly destroy the enemy front, basically making it melt away just for the potential, at that point, flank or rear attacks we could have launched. But by actual size, was not that different. By ambition, when you break through, where do you actually go? Like you must identify some kind of objective, some center, some place you can seize in a reasonable amount of time that gives you some possibility to eventually fortify, to hold. Here, as we'll see, the front was not really offering too much in that sense. So it was possible, of course, that the broader offensive could bring simply to the collapse of the British and the French. But at the same time, as it was observed, yes, you want to attack them exactly where they are separating, which, from one side you have the British and from another the French. But in that sense, aren't you actually striking at both forces in a way that makes them freak out enough to actually hold on the strongest together at the same time? Like this was, in fact, the problem. Wouldn't it have been better to focusing on, knocking out the British first or the French first and then passing on to the other? The terrain posed another challenge. The area south of Arras was, in fact, the same region the Germans had laid waste to during their retreat to the Hindenburg Line in February 1917. It was exactly the same desert that they had abandoned. They had created themselves by literally carrying out a scorched earth strategy, through which now they paradoxically would have themselves to swiftly advance, creating unavoidably a logistical quagmire of sort, which had been one of the greater issues of this. How do you move this enormous amount of forces? As a matter of fact, we're talking millions, right, in scale, through lands that are basically like just razed to the ground, and this entire. It's true, of course, that after years of war, both contendants knew more or less how to wage war in a more updated sense than the one that they had envisaged in 1914. But at the same time, the same lessons that they had learned from these offensives were always practically the same. That logistically speaking, here it wasn't even advancing through, of course, like simply to attack enemy lines. It was really about sustaining an offensive that scale with forces that were also not that dramatically fresh, that should have been also synchronized in their advance, as we'll see now in different sectors, and that should have fundamentally just been able to coordinate thus in a way that would have given a reasonable security regarding the accomplishment of a specific strategic objective. And here it seemed like just let's go full in, right, and see essentially what happens. It's going to be about this pure primal originary force show, and we will essentially prove that all what we said about the German racial superiority over these degenerates is true, etc. And it does make sense, because again, this was a terrifying battle, but not just it failed, it also didn't seem to add anything specific or innovative or original from a strategical point of view. Yes, the Stoßtruppen were great, but that's essentially just a tactical element that works also throughout a system that, as we've seen, cannot simply be broken through. Like the notion of simply surpassing all the, as we'll see now, trench defensive lines that, by the way, the Allies had adopted exactly now from the Germans, that were even in even more in-depth fashion than their prior one, was not something you could simply achieve through Stoßtruppen. All right, that if that had been the case, the war would have been over from quite some time. Of course, there is always in war this dice rolling factor for which you can't say how it's going to go. So you can't look at the Kaiserschlacht as any other big World War I offensive and simply saying, well, this was doomed since the beginning. We're just a bunch of fools, of butchers, or whatever. No, this is not correct. Again, it's also and especially about how many enemies you kill. That's fundamental. And actually, as we've seen during the offensive, like you could even kill as many or more even defenders than the attackers would lose. So you could never really say. It was unleashing such a clamorous amount of force that the result should have been grandiose. And this was also just the last useful chance to do so, right? The Germans had now the strategic initiative. They had to do something about it. And in line of principle, this was correct, right, in practice. In any case, Wetzel argued that it would be wiser to launch an assault at Verdun or in Flanders, where coordination between the French and British would be more difficult to achieve. Right? This was the actually sound project. Yes, we must offend, we must do it, but let's attack just one of the two allies. Let's reattack in Verdun, knock out the French, and then pass to the British in Flanders, or vice versa. But let's not just attack both at the same time and just hope to break through to go where exactly. It's not immediately intuitive. Also because literally if you attack the hinge, you're not attacking simply you're breaking through a front line which is surely like intended to stop anyone coming from the front so that you don't get cut through and again the enemy can infiltrate. But at the same time, you're not really hitting at the core of both forces, nationally wise. You're basically skirting around that and enabling them to some kind of counteroffensive. Of course, if you're very confident in maneuver and you think you can simply outmaneuver the enemy, simply break through and attack them from different directions and make everything collapse because they're not even understanding what's going on, that's something. Otherwise, especially in this World War I situation, the idea of at least taking out one of the two, also from a strictly political point of view, because that's eventually what war is, an instrument of politics, leaves some kind of greater, opportunity for initiating some kind of negotiation regarding the war outcome. So again, there are options. Ludendorff wavered in making a firm choice. On December the 27th, he instructed his team to draft comprehensive plans for a range of offensives, because he also realized that this was extremely risky and that the objections that were presented did make sense. So there were different routes of advance that encompassed. These were in code, like St. George aimed at Azebrook, Michael at Saint-Quentin, Mars frontal attack on Arras, Achilles, later renamed Blücher, targeting the French west of Rheims, and Castor and Pollux, a pincer maneuver against Verdun. So this was the range of offensive from Flanders to Verdun, as we've seen in latitudinal order. It wasn't until January the 21st, 1918, that Ludendorff definitively settled on Operation Michael. Even so, he kept his options open, right? A reduced because the front, of course, was to be held in the other sections. You could inject reserves from different parts. So all these channels, all these corridors were kept ready. He reduced, for example, a version of Mars, preparing to bolster Michael at the same time. And all of our offensive blueprints were held in reserve as contingencies. Also, because, of course, depending on whatever would have happened in terms of hopeful collapse or rearrangement of the enemy fronts, in case of a successful breakthrough, there could be some, in fact, flank or rear attack enactable in the process. Operation Michael was Ludendorff's own creation, by the way, and he meant to guide its execution himself. Right? He had really spent a lot of time and work on this, and he, of course, thought that as the commander-in-chief, the glory of this all of Germany, the Kaiser's recognition would stem from the success of this operation. To achieve this, Ludendorff split the three armies assigned to the offensives between Army Group Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria and the German Crown Prince's command. This division ensured that only the first quartermaster general could oversee the campaign's full scope, and so that there would have not been chances for much autonomy, right, from, if not at these lower levels that were, however, enough busy on their own for their tasks not to really divert much. In any case, it was a firmly controlled operation. Yes, the Germans maintained their own, as we've seen, options open together with their general autonomy orientation. But as we'll see now, the gigantic offensive just per se lacked that brilliance that could counter some more combined operation, some more articulate plan. It was fine for simplicity. That's one of the classical criteria, like for a military plan, and it counted especially on the German strength, the German power as a people, as a nation, as a country, man to man, from the Stoßtruppen to the tank crews, and of course the rank and file infantrymen under a massive artillery barrage like the one the Germans could still use. But again, with this last grandiose display. If this failed, it was basically over. Yet, as we were already hinting at before, there was a more fundamental as critical weakness to the Michael's plan. That is to say, it had no specific endpoint. Right? You could say a broader objective at the end of the day, because after piercing the British defenses between La Fère and Croisille, the German forces were to veer northeast and essentially press onward to Perrone-Arras and beyond. But eventually to do what? Right? This approach reflected, of course, a tactical improvisation rather than an ultimate objective. In every plan, you must really have an endpoint, right? Then you can't create another plan. Everything, of course, can adequate itself to the circumstances. There is, of course, a genius in doing that. Command must be prepared to obediences. And it's not like, in fact, like this big push, this big breakthrough would have just happened without opportunities opening along the way. But if you do not know since the beginning what you have to actually do, everything becomes, also for those who are really in charge, less motivating, right? Because you literally do not know what you're going to do. And creating, as obvious, a strategic uncertainty that is not going to help the broader cause. Now, to cut off the British from the broader Allied line would demand an additional 90-kilometer advance after taking Arras, but no nearer significant targets lay along the intended path of attack. So for Ludendorff, achieving the long-desired breakthrough had become basically the ultimate goal in itself, right? It's as if this war had so much, let's say, focused the attention of the impossibility, or at least in this costly, unbearable, intolerable breakthrough capacity, that the latter was seen almost as the achievement that should have stunned everybody and caused like this moral effect, implying eventually a collapse. We're saying such an astonishing accomplishment to literally put in crisis the entire trench, the frontline system for how it had developed in trench warfare, right? This was, however, really a great problem. We will see this. Everything would be better with maps at hand. And in fact, looking at sector after sector, because that's how you can also make an entire series about this battle, for the amount of information that we have on it. Now, we will hopefully do this at some point, but here we have to maintain the focus on the bigger picture. And this is what essentially the Ludendorff's plan was mostly criticized for. At the same time, the Allies were keenly conscious that a substantial German offensive was in preparation. Again, this is clear from the shift in initiative from both sides and the tempos in the preparation of the operations. Throughout the winter of 1917-18, German divisions poured westward from the Eastern Front. That had been the bigger deal, right? So freeing this enormous amount of troops bolstered by Russia's defeat, because also the width of the Eastern Front, because again, the Tsarist Empire had collapsed, also thanks to, the German, unfortunately, to the German injection of Lenin's revolutionary impetus, let's say, into Russia, which allowed a considerable influx of troops and equipment, again, for the Germans to exploit, to capitalize upon. In fact, this seemed really this had been the biggest deal, right? The fact that a major opponent of the alliance had been knocked out, and finally, like that breakthrough seemingly would have allowed for a German equal breakthrough in the West with all these reacquired forces on that theater. I will not digress on different aspects of this old nor on Lenin's issue. Like, there are some people are all about, let's cut the funds to, support this kind of ideology in this country, because I don't agree with that. That's not why it's there, right? It may not be the best thing you can do, but if you are to send, like in this case, a revolutionary to undermine a regime that you want to make collapse, and at this point, all the outcome of the Russian Civil War and the rise of the Soviet Union was not objectively predictable, right? Today, we would know better to do something different, but still, just for example, a greater help to the whites during the war would have, from the side of the West, would have not made the Soviet Union happen, for example. So it's a bit like what I was talking about Versailles. It's not because of Versailles as such that, Hitler rose to power. That's not how it happened. In any case, going back to our time, because this seemed like really promising for the Germans and scary for the Allies. So first, this is important of making strategic analysis. First, you see what, let's say, regardless of who had the moral upper hand in this game, but what they respectively felt, right? What they felt they confident to, and what they to be able of doing, and then what they feared to fail, like, from both sides. It tells you really what was the actual chance also for the German plan to succeed after all. Sir Douglas Haig, the British commander on the Western Front, persistently urged London's war cabinet to send reinforcements to brace for the looming German attack. Right, this had been a major issue. We were talking about it before, the relation with the States, France and Britain, like pressuring much for new forces to be sent, but also for the respective countries to field others. And after years of war and millions of casualties, the thing was becoming really serious, because the Germans were really that threatening. And this is still a war of attrition, by the way. It's not just like, most wars that we know in a broader sense, but here there is a front line, and regardless of the presence of this major offensives or not, still, shots are fired, people get killed. So, as you know, in 1917, they had major, essentially, mutinies, socialism was spreading. There had been a change at the top in many circumstances. All those failed offensives had spread sort of defeatism and or this sort of sense of rejection towards just the horror that had followed. Now, Haig is an interesting figure. Of course, he was the field marshal commanding the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, that is in fact the British contingent in mainland Europe, from December 1915 onward. Right, his wartime career included the first Ypres, 1914, as corps commander. He helped stabilize the line on that occasion. Loos in 1915, his first major offensive as army commander, using gas, by the way, but with limited success. The Somme in 1916, as the BEF commander, he oversaw this massive, costly offensive criticized for its high casualties, over 400,000 British losses. And then Arras and Passchendaele. In 1917, we'll talk more about the latter, because it had been really just the final strain to this sense of how many casualties for so few, right? These further offensives under his leadership were really with mixed results and heavy losses. Haig's strategy emphasized attrition, believing Germany would break first. But his persistence, despite staggering losses, drew criticism, though he retained command through 1918, adapting to new tactics like tanks, as we've seen. Haig's vision is as important as familiar in a way, because even though this war, again, was really novel and by scale and size, it was just hallucinating and as we've seen, just making both sides seeing things that probably weren't there. The understanding that this was an attritional warfare, and that at the end of the day, Germany had all her problems, mostly the fact that they had been bottled up in the North Sea. They couldn't simply go out there receiving external help, etc. Like, just the idea of, pressing on the Germans, maintaining keeping the initiative, maintaining the offensive, and so killing them, just like in a slaughterhouse, and relying on the enormous resources that, after all, the British Empire plus France and other allies had, seemed like correct. Just at the time, the bloodshed was already shocking enough, like emotionally speaking, for these historical cultures to simply raise doubts on the conduct of the war, hence also the myth of the butchers, etc. Naturally, there was a much bigger game at play at large, because, again, you had other fronts, like as we've seen, the Italian one. There had been, in fact, the Eastern one that now was de facto over. So it was not, again, a positive situation, and you always have these ups and downs that also morally are shattering you in so many ways, and this is true especially for those who are at the top in many ways, especially also in terms of consequence of this. In fact, British Prime Minister Lloyd George had grown disillusioned with Hague after the grueling mud and blood ordeal of Passchendaele, especially. Passchendaele is really a mess. This is essentially the Third Battle of Ypres, July-November 1917. A brutal slog through Flanders mud. The Field Marshal Douglas Hay aimed to break through German lines and capture U-boat bases on the Belgian coast. I talked a bit about the U-boats in the video about mostly the Second World War, but I talked a bit about the first one as a background, because this was also like not the first time these strategies were employed, but they reached like a very important and at this point transatlantic level. Initial gains stalled as torrential rain turned the battlefield into a quagmire, bogging down troops and tanks. The battle cost over 300,000 British casualties for minimal territorial gains, about 5 miles, with scenes of soldiers drowning in mud haunting public perception. Like Lloyd George, already skeptical of Hague's attritional strategy after the Somme, so Passchendaele's senseless waste eroding his trust and prompting him to withhold reinforcements in 1918, which was not really... it was understandable from some broader domestic point of view, but at the same time, the war required that constant level of, now especially defensive, manpower, considering the German offensive. So it was a delicate situation. It shows how complicated war is, if anything, from a political point of view, first and foremost. That's as we are evidently exposed also today. Besides, national unity was really felt, right? Lloyd George hesitated to bear the political fallout of sacking the king's preferred general. It would have really shattered British morale, not just in the front lines, but at home, because at the end of the day, why were you doing that all? And in fact, that was the point. Like, if you are using war as a political instrument, you must accept what it entails. It's just like, I don't know, from the German side, at some point, the higher commander had been removed because of the failure of Verdun, and so there were different realignments internally that influenced, of course, both politics and strategy, but there was still a war to fight. So how do you proceed? And in fact, this is a bit what we get wrong about World War I in general, the fact that those generals that were moved were the bad ones, the butchers or whatever. This happened more or less in every major country in the war at some point towards the end, or at least before the end proper. And it seemed like everything changed or things were bad. No, right? It's a mirage. Actually, the finest commanders were exactly the ones who caused the greatest slaughter. That paradoxically would have actually brought probably the war to a more rapid ending. That's something we can't, again, sort of speculate on, considering what I said about what ifs, but it's a perspective to be considered, especially if you start reading von Clausewitz. That's the first thing you're going to read about the humanistic purpose in warfare that actually causes way more unnecessary deaths than that straightforward mentality. And so here there were systems that were being tested truly, not just on the front line, as we know. Concerned that a strengthened Hague might embark on yet another calamitous offensive, Lloyd George declined to provide additional soldiers to France, though. So that would have required sort of an increase of the same number of units. This was actually the extent by which that was prevented. This was a problem on the field. Hague remained relatively unperturbed by such failures to obtain replacements for his 60 weary divisions. Men need a replacement, especially considering such terrible conditions they fought in. I made a video about trench warfare lifestyle that sort of explains that a bit. And over the past 3 years, neither side had managed, as we know, to secure a definitive breach on the Western Front. The British Army had always been celebrated for its resilience when holding the line, but surely that had come at an important cost. By March 1918, 192 German divisions would confront 172 Allied ones, including 12 from Belgium, though not accounting for 4 oversized American divisions. Right, a difference that hardly represented a commanding edge in numbers. If you had, just to give an idea, the Germans deployed roughly something between 900,000 1 million men, right? And the British something from 600 to 700,000 in total. The French 500 to 600,000 in total. Those were the numbers. Indeed, the Allies had held a more significant manpower advantage in the West the prior year. Yet, it hadn't yielded a decisive result. Right? You see here also how France had sort of relatively scaled back compared to her overall role there. And basically, the war fought in its own land. The British, the Americans had injected, again, more forces. And now the Germans had alone, like this, just the capacity to field so many troops could challenge these defenders. That, however, as you know, enjoy not just numerical superiority in this case, but of course the intrinsic advantages of defense. That is the strong form of war, although with a negative purpose, like negative objective, because you don't have the initiative, and so you can't give sort of time to the enemy to devise some more diversionary maneuvering plan with greater sort of combined arms capacity. This is also a bit what, as we were saying before, the Germans couldn't really enact. And at large, of course, the bigger the forces involved and the least options you really have in terms of how to spend them, how to employ them. It's a terrible deadlock, and so there is just so much you can do to even move a single part of the mechanism. Over the long haul, though not immediately, the Allies had the upper hand as American forces continued to disembark in Europe, but it wasn't just enough for them just to claim like a decisive superiority. Theoretically, the British had embraced a variation of the German defense in-depth approach. By late 1917, in fact, after observing German tactics such as the elastic defense at the Hindenburg Line and facing setbacks like Cambray's counterattack, the British began adopting a defense in-depth system as well. Essentially, the Germans had devised a system consisting of 3 tiers of fortifications intent to wear down an assailant. These tiers were called forward, battle, and rear. Forward zone, the battle zone, and the rear area. This makes sense. They immediately give you essentially the meaning of it all. From a medieval perspective, like say, in my late 13th, early 14th century, this is like the tribal battle line in depth that has, in fact, similar concept. Like the forward zone is meant to basically stall the enemy main assault. The battle one is where most of the engagement is taking place, and the rear area is maybe this force that is going to really inject reserves, fresh troops that can be decisive when an enemy has really exhausted most of his forces into the main engagement, right? And at that point, numbers do not count even that much. At that point, freshness is key, as von Clausewitz has explained to us. In any case, the principle is really simple, right? It maintains simplicity, cohesion, say on of command, reserves, like this gradual injection of forces. We've seen this in action also on other occasions when the Allies had not fully adopted the same German tripartition. These areas are going to basically form themselves by themselves over time. So in this sense, especially envisaging the German offensive, the Allies had taken especially defensive measures. These three tiers of fortifications and relative battle lines, or lines of, where troops would have been positioned, were each supposed to feature their own systems of barbed wire, trenches, and fortified positions. In reality, the trenches were frequently shallow. We're talking specifically the Allied side in this context, and the strong points were often left unfinished. Because, in part, again, the Allies had been attacking the previous year, so there had been just enough time to establish a more defensive approach, at least in theory. Much still had to be done, right? That tells you also how tight, right, resources were, how you're not there just camping. But the German side was also suffering, also because of the shortages in the domestic front. We will see it in the end here. Across much of the British front, work on the rear area defenses that had not had even yet started. So this tells you that basically behind the fighting line was nothing and nowhere to retreat to, at least in the immediacy of the issue. In fact, this would be a problem during the initial German breakthrough for the British. Logistics presented yet another hurdle also in defense. Haig, for example, did not have enough troops to be robust everywhere, right? So as we've seen, he had tried to ask for more troops, and he ended up focusing his trained divisions in Flanders to protect mostly the channel ports, the lifeline for his army's supplies and reinforcements. So other areas in theory could fall, but if you severed the control of the channel ports, this is something that would happen also in the Battle of Europe in 1944. We have seen it with the Battle of the Ardennes, that basically had the same purpose in a broader sense, for very different context, but still without those you couldn't supply the army, you couldn't get enough reinforcement, everything would have really melted away. A breach for not talking about 1940, by the way. As a result, General Gough's Fifth Army was left with just 14 divisions, 3 of which were cavalry, by the way, to guard a front stretching over 60 kilometers from Gouzeaucourt to just south of the river Oise. The cavalry element, believe it or not, is actually relevant, especially if an enemy breaks through. Again, you must counter him in ways that he doesn't have much time to prepare countermeasures. Again, trench warfare was not the only way that cavalry had become relatively outdated. But of course, if you catch an advancing enemy in the open, with cavalry charge, you can still do things. I mean, they even had cavalry charges against trenches during World War I, so that was actually still a thing. And you shouldn't actually deride that, because there is still a logic in that maximized form of attack like cavalry can provide, even though we are already in the era of tank warfare. And again, we could make a comparison between the two things. In any case, as I said, at the end of the war, actually cavalry came back in vogue, so to say, to press on the enemy, for example, during the withdrawal mostly. But here also for counterattacks on shattered, tired units during, as we've seen here, confused advances. Now, by comparison, the British Third Army stationed to Gough's left had 14 infantry divisions to defend a shorter 42-kilometer stretch from Flesquières up to Arras. So more concentrated troops, and that's where fundamentally, a breakthrough was less feasible. In any case, as signs grew that Gough's thinly dispersed force was the Germans' main target, so as we've seen attacking the southern part, so on the British right and the French left, because forces were thinner there, Haig eventually permitted some extra divisions to be placed behind the 5th as well. Right? It was sort of understood that, also tapping there, that possible breakthrough was crucial to maintain the front line. So immediately the obvious fears that the front line could collapse was there. Like the Germans were capable of doing that and causing great havoc among the Allied lines. However, Haig withheld control of these reserves from Gough himself, and they were in fact positioned as far as 35 kilometers back. In fact, too far to offer prompt aid to anyone, because it's basically a day's march, say half day's march if there's a full retreat of the front line, that in any case means basically there is a route. This is not a fallback. Usually the aforementioned lines stretch like tens of kilometers. Here you have an entire day of march before those forces can effectively reach the broken part of the line. In part, this is done to avoid throwing these forces into a route that can be disorderly, where things are not yet clear. But at the same time, it also prevents from offering prompt support to, for example, a faltering Rhine that could benefit from those reserves injected. As we've seen, the British didn't have such dramatically in-depth defenses, especially there, and enough men to simply hold as it would have been good enough, let's say. For Operation Michael, Ludendorff gathered 63 assault divisions between Arras and La Fère. On the right, von Bellow's 17th Army, 23 divisions, faced off Julian Byng's 3rd Army. In the center, 2 corps from General von der Marwitz's 2nd Army concealed their movements opposite the British 5th Corps, which occupied the Flesquières salient. Farther south, the rest of the 2nd Army, 13 divisions, confronted the northern 2 corps, the 7th and the 19th, and Gough's force. On the left, General Oskar von Uthier's 18th Army overwhelmed the remaining 2 corps, the 18th and the 3rd of the British 5th Army, with a ratio of 24 divisions to 6, right, which is even more than the 3-to-1 ratio that you would ideally have, which would be already a big deal, in fact, to conduct an offensive. So this part of the Allied line was particularly weak. You see how the actual parts where, say, the line could be broken through and reserves injected, in fact, would be spotted by the Germans. So front lines are actually a very complex thing. It's not just about barbed wire and machine guns, right? Different depths, probably different manpower, and lots of other also terrain features like supplying system and so on. Command, right? Say distance from critical positions and more. So it's actually a very complicated picture. It's not just a simple game. Trench warfare, we'll know how to do it. It's always a challenge, and it always offers for, again, the degree of unpredictability based also on different opportunities to exploit along the way. Even though his most formidable army, Uthier's 18th, was pitted against the weakest British contingent on his left, Ludendorff chose to focus the primary thrust, though, on the right, that is the essentially northern flank, where British defenses were much sturdier. Uthier, who had orchestrated and executed the triumphant offensive against the Russians at Riga the year before, was chiefly assigned to protect the flank against the French. This was, in fact, not seen necessarily as a top decision. By the way, consider that the overall picture here of forces involved is greatly at the say the Germans are of all the 1.5 million men that they actually will inject into the system. Operation Michael will see 900 to 1 million. That's what I was talking about before. And while I said that, of course, like the French, the British had in total something like 1.2, 1.3 millions, actually the first forces involved were less, right? The British at the beginning, I mean, to counter those German forces, the British had 300 to 350,000. So in the later phases, it would involve other hundreds of thousands. That's why we say, okay, this at the end of the day, the battle was something between the Germans 1.4 million versus 600, 700,000 from the British, 500, 600 for the French. But the immediacy of the breakthrough, which was incredibly risky, entailed German forces to be injected basically by the wide majority. So you would have had just some, of course, fresh reserves at that point of hundreds of thousands of men in consistent numbers, even 500,000 men. But against more than double enemies that at that point would have been pretty shattered, and nobody knew, of course, how things would actually go. By the way, the French, I was saying before, had something like between 100 and 150,000 initially involved, and so they injected to 500, 600,000 just as the German offensive continued. But as we will see now, we will cover the initial days of the attack. That are the moments in which is understood basically that the German offensive can go only so far. In fact, in the mess that is unleashed, you can barely understand what's going on. Also from the German side, most of those forces are spent. It doesn't matter how, say, intact they can be after the attack, but say you have essentially brought them to, somewhere where they can't simply pull out at this point. So they are already into battle, and there is just so much that you can do at that point. Is mostly without a massive breakthrough on the defenders to in fact rally and try to counter further, especially against any reserve that you're going to throw in. And this is how Operation Michael started, right? It kicked off at 4:40 a.m. on March the 21st with an intense barrage from roughly 6,000 German artillery pieces. Across the 65-kilometer front held by the British 3rd and 5th Armies, a deluge of gas and high explosives battered their positions. The Germans had a lot of practice in this because they had led the greatest offensives in the war with this, again, always clamorous sort of beyond reach mentality. This is typically German. That's how they always operated, really, to overachieve or to overreach, right? And literally for, in fact, like the objective at the end of the day not to be accomplished. But it's also a sound strategic principle. If you have that force to spend, do it immediately, because that's the moment you have to punch the hardest, so that after it's going to be easier. Like just not having enough, not spending how much you can, of course, in a way that is effective as well, which was really the problem at the end of the day, to the point of even destroying the landscape, to the point that your own troops in advance would not recognize it, would not be able to orient themselves on it, for how the maps were literally redrawn. This happened at Verdun is another story, and so it's always out of reach. Nobody had ever waged this kind of bombardments before in military history, so it was all lesson learned from previous years. The German onslaught proved especially destructive in the south, as it was predictable, where the skilled artillerist Colonel Bruchmüller directed the 18th Army's bombardment. This bombardment went on for 5 hours, so that at 9:40 a.m., shielded by a rolling artillery barrage, the Stoßtruppen began their advance. They were lucky, in a sense, at least because a dense fog blanketed the morning, not clearing until noon, offering concealment for the attack. This is not a Herbstnebel, it's Frühlingsnebel. Something similar what the Ardennes offensive was conceived like. The idea that even this misty atmosphere would favor this natural forces of nature would favor the German advance. Now, shrouded in mist, well-armed units searched for vulnerabilities in the British lines that had been adequately softened up by this massive artillery barrage, eventually pushing far into the enemy's rear. They succeeded in so many points. British strongholds that weren't immediately overtaken were quickly cut off, and that was the greatest issue there. No connection, at least linking up with other forces for support, could be isolated and taken down easily, especially when the bulk of the enemy infantry advanced. Gough's Third Corps was nearly wiped out in the process, exposing the right flank of the remaining Fifth Army forces. The Fifth Army's forward zone was rapidly overrun, with German troops swiftly pressing into the battle. This was where most of the showdown was going to go. Byng's Third Army, with a more favorable ratio of troops to territory, held up somewhat more effectively. The German efforts to eliminate the Flesquières salient fell short, and the 17th Army couldn't pierce the British battle zone. Still, Byng's 6th Corps, located southeast of Arras, suffered heavy casualties, and Courcelles was captured by the Germans. So from a tactical standpoint, things were going reasonably well for the Germans so far, but Ludendorff didn't share the quick thinking and versatility of his stormtroopers. Rather than adapting his approach to leverage the stronger gains on his left flank that was now gaining momentum, he kept chasing a breakthrough against the Third Army instead. On March the 22nd, the previous day's events played out again. The 18th Army advanced steadily against Gough's crumbling forces, while the 17th, together with the center and right wings of the 2nd Army, made only halting headway against Byng's determined resistance, though Ludendorff sent 6 divisions to bolster Hutier. He maintained his northeastward focus, even as a wide gap began to form in the British line to the west. This is, by the way, interesting because this is originally what the same Ludendorff had hoped for, but here he wanted essentially to break through further the tougher part of the British defenses. That did seem to be giving way, and that sort of makes sense. Like if that's the toughest part and that gives way, and you have already achieved those results in the south, you do accomplish some complete devastation of those British armies. However, that original plan that envisaged like simply a massive breakthrough and then maybe hoping to puzzle, to paralyze the enemy and to take it out piece by piece was not tried. This window of opportunity in general was short-lived, as you understand, because the Allies were reacting to what had happened. It was massive, it was big, right? And Haig had, here we're not even descending into the carnage that this was, but it wasn't just a swift breakthrough. Like there had been major casualties from the German side as well, as you can imagine. Now Haig had earlier coordinated with French Army commander, the General Pétain, to have 6 divisions ready to reinforce Gough if the Germans broke through. And going beyond his commitment, Pétain soon dispatched actually more, almost double, 11 divisions northward to close the breach. This seemed appropriate because the British were in trouble and the French too, as a consequence. So they behaved pertinently and they sent the right amount of forces to stem the German breakthrough. At the same time, Haig now certain the southern flank was the Germans' main target because evidently, again, that's where most of the fort was concentrated, started pulling divisions from Flanders and shifting them south, right? So again, Ludendorff had this in-between way. I mean, he had this literally all these sections of the line. He chose not to break through the latter. That was literally probably the point where the hinge between the French and the English was created, and it was literally giving way in the way envisaged, just the sector slightly above, like under the Flemish one. And so at that point, you see, it's what we were saying before, like you give this very big blow, right? And the situation, of course, is very fluid in the moment, right? The breakthrough breaks, like literally scatters forces in ways that, are unpredictable. And if, as an offender, you have the upper hand in strength, you of course go far. But at that point, if the system holds, like if the line doesn't break, the situation also kind of crystallizes, because it's still World War I especially, and not only for that. So that, of course, there were all lines of defense here, as we've seen. This indecision about the southernmost British section that was wavering, really about to be completely overwhelmed, is instead tapped by French reinforcements and by also the British Flemish units that Haig had sent to reinforce, because at that point he understood that the Channel ports were basically not the objective of Germans. You couldn't really tell. I mean, here we'll talk about intelligence in World War I, like strategic assessment and so on. But of course, there was an element of surprise. You couldn't know 100% exactly where all forces came. Like major offensives were seen coming from Mons, as it's obvious, but how they're going to unfold, it's a bit of a different story. If we're not talking about the outcome, because you may never know, even if you prepare enough forces, how these are going to react. Now, even with this response, Ludendorff still had a chance to exploit the Allied junction point, and by pressing aggressively towards Amiens and Abbeville, to drive a wedge between the French and the British armies. Right, where still the reserves. Today, basically, we see just these first days of the offensive, where military historians say basically that's where the Germans basically failed, but that's where they lost immediately, because how the situation was basically crystallized at this point, it was over, even with the reserves injection. But it still, again, depended on these very moments. In fact, on the third day of the offensive, Ludendorff, instead of pressing again on that weak spot of the Allied lines, instructed his three armies to pursue separate paths even, right? Instead of concentrating force, and so creating that punching head to really break through, he literally did what seemed, surely in his intention, this was meant to broaden a front that he thought was basically giving way and creating a massive gap that simply couldn't be put back together by the Allies. But this actually stemmed from, of course, it was very difficult to recognize what was going on from the field with the means of the times, really, but he knew that the offensive was not over, that there were still chances for this to fail, right? He truly managed to break through the Allies' lines, but not everywhere he should have, and not by keeping pressure exactly on that same point. The 17th, that's how he basically separated his armies. The 17th was to head northeast towards St. Paul and west via Doullens to Abbeville. The second was to strike west along the Somme towards Amiens. And the 18th was to thrust southwest against the French. This final order was especially misguided, as it forced Houtier to abandon his tight pursuit of the British Fifth Army. And again, Houtier had been particularly good, as we've seen, against the Russians at doing that. So the British, as we've seen, didn't even have a proper line to retreat to. They were in difficult straits, to say the least, and they were being pressed by the Germans, and Houtier was told to stop because he had to redirect somewhere else. So imagine even just the frustration of this all and this apparently incomprehensible decisions. Now looking back, now of course I'm also making just a simple video about the topic. Like if we were to study historically and accurately all the steps here, like it would take forever. But this is also what things played like in general. Now looking back, this day, March the 23rd, because later there was the darkest day that St. Ludendorff identified, but it was this one, it seems like the culminating point of the offensive, March the 23rd, marking the moment Ludendorff lost the battle. Again, imagine out of 1.4 million soldiers, you have spent at this point something like between 900 and 1,000 and 1 million, right? And so, again, what you have achieved here, it's going to mostly dictate the rest of the operation. It's been said that basically even the war for Germany was lost on this day. As early as that, again, it was typical for this offensive to continue. Think about Verdun, that lasted for most of the year still, but to have basically failed from the first days in reaching its fundamental objectives, right? But still the attritional aspect seemed like, okay, let's throw more or less, and that's also how you alter strategic quantities here. But here it's riskier than ever, right? And with an unprecedented effort, right, in considering the relative context. Of course, it wasn't obvious on March the 23rd, 1918, that Germany had failed at this battle, and even less that the war was simply lost. In fact, there would be other interesting scenarios evolving throughout the year. Nevertheless, this was the major focus, right? The major theater. The Germans, from their side, tended to, of course, acclaim the fact that Ludendorff had managed to break through the enemy lines. And elated Kaiser Wilhelm II marked the occasion by presenting Ludendorff's formal superior, Chief of Staff General Paul von Hindenburg, with the Iron Cross with golden rays. This was a very high honor, last awarded to Marshal Blücher in 1814. So we're talking really about a defining moment in the history of the Second German Empire, at this point really dictated by the news about on the Western Front and the carnage that was taking place. So in general, of course, the news were correct that the enemy lines had been broken, but that this offensive was simply to fully break through the entire enemy front was another matter. In any case, German home front morale soared as official reports declared triumph, and you know that Hindenburg and Ludendorff were running Germany as a dictatorship at this point because, of course, of the martial law, of the general, this massive restraints that were placed on the population in wartime, fooding, and with enormous, that there were famines, people were literally starving to death in Germany. It was a terrible situation. Of course, all the hopes were really placed on this major offensive, for which there had been, of course, a lot of internal propaganda and more. So this seemed like such a great moment, like we made it. You know, even though it eventually doesn't happen, it's not like today. You have the internet to see what happens. Now, newspapers are controlled by the government. You have like a very tight, control placed on any kind of information. There is police controlling the army properly. Like even the front itself prevents spies to cross through. It's really a very gloomy and sort of very difficult time, to say the least. So these news were spread in part because, of course, the high command, the government knew that the victory wasn't simply there, could be behind the corner at this point, but it was a bit too early. In any case, if you let the Germans hear that there had been a major tactical success of some sort, and also a strategical one evidently, but even without a major breakthrough, it still could raise morale, which is really what these people needed, especially to in among the same troops that were partially informed of this, because again, if you're a final rank soldier, it's not like you know exactly what is happening all across the front. You need to be told. So it's different times, but very fascinating ones. By the way, there is all an ideological, cultural, national ethos here involved. The Kaiserschlacht, I mean, how many men died at this point, like for the Kaiser, literally shouting that in their war cries during the assaults of the enemy trenches. It's really brutal. It really shows like the capacity of men to just root in for specific causes in the direst of straits and really carrying out incredible feats that even when they're ultimately going to be doomed and basically forgotten and blamed at the end of the day. So that there is all that psychological loop in the Freikorps that we described, and that at some point we'll have to connect further even with the way this war was told in Germany, in the world, and so on. In fact, from the battlefield, predictably enough, a contrasting story was emerging. In fact, as soon as March the 24th, the storm troops' spirits were starting to falter. There was so much, of course, they could do alone. Losses had been staggering among them, of course, but also among the regular infantry. And the fast-paced advance complicated the force to tend the wounded, for example. I mean, literally, people were left in between, behind what had already been conquered, but literally with into no man's land. As you know, the greatest problem was to carry stuff through, like with all that sort of wasteland covered in craters, etc. This had been the great problem, usually, that you could break through the first line of defenses, but then you had to be supplied in a way that you could resist counterattacks or even move on if you were lucky. Now, food and ammo supplies trailed behind as the Germans navigated such wasteland they created. By the way, including the one of the year before, as we've seen, they had retreated from Arras, like shifting to the Hindenburg line. By the way, there was something that deeply struck the Germans at this point, really hitting their morale. Because when they stormed the British rear positions, the Kaiser's soldiers discovered huge stockpiles of food, wine, and clothing. You would say, well, yes, I understand what this means. Like the British were probably, faring better than them. Or also the French. Well, the French wine and, a bit better places than the ones the Germans had carved for themselves, even having to abandon the mine, as we've seen in the previous months. But there was more than that, right? Of course, the Germans were not on vacation, just nor the British nor the French were at that point. But regarding the propaganda, for months, the German government had claimed that the British were suffering deprivation from the U-boat blockade, right? And this was already, as you know, how powerful propaganda always is during wars. Now these soldiers that surely had hoped even for this day to happen, because let's stress it, many soldiers, if not properly the majority of them, wanted to fight and to kill. Let's abandon this idiocy mentality that, these were just people sent to war, poor dears. No, these people were aggressive. They wanted to attack. It's just like at Verdun. They didn't want to stop. They didn't want to be timed. They wanted to attack, and just to get into hand-to-hand fighting. And so they were so motivated, but now they discovered that their government had lied to them, and that it wasn't true that the British were starving to death because of the U-boat, that were causing damage, but not to that point. Of course, the Allies had a better, resource situation. Let's put it in this way. We've explained it since the beginning. I mean, how could the British have tanks in that quantity? Of course, the British, the French navies kept the seas open for all their allies. They reinforced the Italians. They had colonial troops coming from all over the world. They had the Americans that were coming, and that's the strait. So, and that could, there was a general world economy literally working in a way that continental powers did not have. All right. So of course Germany and Austria-Hungary were suffering pretty harshly from this. Just Eastern Europe was arguably worse because, of course, like the general savagery of the situation. But really, these were extremely tough days and such enormous bloodshed, carnage, and even they discovered that the enemy, after all, was actually even softer than it seemed. I mean, as we've seen, the British didn't even have this enormously, well dug fortifications even, but such big the German effort had to dislodge them just for sound position, plus they had so much food. Like, it seemed like those guys were, in fact, much less intense than the Germans that had taken this sort of more lightly than them. But that at the end of the day, this wasn't over, and that still the Germans could be taken at bay. It's psychologically devastating because much of these nationalistic propagandas also revolved around the notion of being a superior civilization. And that's the moment in which the Germans sort of realized that, at least from a material point of view, that equated to something in positivistic sense they weren't. And so they were fighting against a more advanced world than their own, regardless of what still people somehow weirdly believe about, the progressive faith of Germany, had they won the war or whatever. Like, this Germany was, a very sort of 1 century before, they were in feudalism. This is just even in the formament. There is no doubt that this contributed also to the ferocious, fanatic aggressiveness and effectiveness of the German soldier, especially of the Staatstruppen, etc. But that's not enough just per se, or at least it mirrors, let's say, that if you have to resort to just that intensity, it's because you have to make up for lots of other things. Even so, in just 4 days, the Germans had seized more territory than all the Allied offensives of the prior 3 years combined. The Kaiserschlacht definitely did open a huge salient into the enemy lines. On March the 23rd, Paris itself had come under bombardment from a unique battery of German guns able to hit the city, famously enough, from over 100 kilometers away. That's yet another sad chapter in the destruction of many, works. So think about the Cathedral of Rheims, like it was bombarded during the war. I mean, in northeastern France, as you know, much of our Middle Ages is concentrated. And in this sense, the Germans saw it as, we are the true empire, like the French sort of bogs. I made a video about this topic, like why wasn't France part of the Holy Roman Empire or the Holy Roman Empire historically? And so you have to evaluate, think of all the great personalities, all the great historians, writers, etc., that participated to this war, and think about how different the world was. I mean, the difference between especially Western and Central Europe is particularly evident, even more evident at this point. And countries like Germany, for example, today are incredibly Americanized as a consequence of World War II. But at that time, of course, and even more before World War I, where you still literally had the Kaiser, well, things were really different. Now, to the Allied leaders, oblivious to Ludendorff's struggles but painfully aware of their own, the outlook seemed bleak. They didn't know. Right. This is also another beautiful aspect of military history, that it teaches you to understand that there is something that you do not know in the moment, and that you should not let yourself being demoralized by. Right. Holding on, being resilient, and especially as von Clausewitz says, if you have a specific plan, you don't have to throw it away. Right? If you have decided to stand your ground somewhere, unless there is something particularly devastating happening that forces reason, you in doubt, right? It's more strategically relevant to maintain on your footsteps, and this is exactly what Ludendorff in part failed at doing. considering the as we've seen what the plan he had envisaged was eventually unfolded. We will talk about the second half of the offensive because now we reached the culminating point, but we will surely talk about this further in another video. It was important to talk about the Kaiserschlacht because the outcomes of that we will necessarily discuss better in the general, of course, meaning of this for World War One, for in fact the world that came out of it. I was glad just to address, and really again, every time unexpectedly, every time I talk about World War One, for some reason I'm elated. This massive bloodshed, sort of Schwerpunkt, what's wrong with you? Well, it's not about that, as you understand. It's not just about that. It's the point that there is something so close to us that is, however, let's say, a bit simplified. This is true also with World War II, etc. We'll talk about, hopefully, any chapter in the history of warfare that bears this relevance in perspective. We have really to talk a lot about the 20th century in general, but I mean really a lot, not just on the basis of a battle or two, but literally what can even a history of the 20th century be done at large. This is a question that once a colleague of mine posed to quite say inappropriately, or say it was a good question, but it was wasted for that context mostly. Can we make a history of the 20th century? This is incredibly difficult to answer as a question because we are grappling in what was happening in the 21st, having skipped, giving a meaning to the 20th century. We're wondering about it even now. So it's difficult to immediately get this, but it's obvious that only through such histories we can gradually try to find an answer together. Again, it's difficult, and on Schwerpunkt I can do so far. It's not easy to go on, but we always have our own good spirit. And this is actually the beauty of war as well, is that it teaches you to actually believe, right, that there is something more to, again, what you think, that even times that are very hard and that are so difficult and unpredictable aren't actually that difficult or unpredictable to when, say, things will actually happen. It's they will eventually unfold. You will eventually know how to give an answer to that. It can still be a painful answer, but there is something to it which is soothing enough for understanding, at least for getting somewhere that can bring at least to healing, to a position where you can recognize what happened. And I would say that history is exactly this. Sometimes we tell history because we want to make sense of such brutality, such mistakes, such ignorance that is objectively difficult to simply reconcile with a positive faith in humanity. That's also a perspective that one gets, especially when one studies these wars. There is always a sense of of devastation that truly and really goes beyond what we can simply see in these pages. But it's also true that kind of mean that you can grow and you can be let's say more aware of something, not simply letting it go as a cliche, right? For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, do a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.